This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Ms. Kellyanne Shaw, a partner at Aiken Gump's Lobbying and Public Policy Practice. Ms. Shaw spent a decade in the government service, most recently serving as the Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs in the first Trump administration. Prior to the White House, she served as Trade Counsel to the House Ways and Means Committee. Ms. Shaw joins us today for a discussion on recent tariff developments and the geopolitical implications of rising international trade tensions. Stay with us as we speak with Ms. Kellyanne Shaw. Kellyanne Shaw, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're so happy to have you. You are the one with the precise expertise in trade law, but also having served at the top of the government, not only in the executive branch, but also up in the Congress, the primary committee that deals with trade issues. So we really appreciate you lending your expertise to this discussion today.
Happy to do so.
Let's just start with the basics here. Can you walk us through the trade war as it currently stands, and how does last week's announcement to reduce tariffs and secure rare earth minerals change that landscape?
Sure, happy to do so. And if we were doing this in my office, you would see behind my desk what looks a little bit like a murder board with all the different tariffs and the lines drawn to what's happening with what country and where. So maybe I'll start with that. So right now we have the United States has a 10% across the board tariff on all imports from almost every single country on earth. And there are a few exceptions to that. So one is with Canada and Mexico, where we actually have a 25% tariff due to fentanyl. So these are these IEEPA tariffs. And there are some carve-outs for any goods that qualify for our trade agreement, USMCA. And the other exception is with China. And so here we actually also have a 30% tariff. 20% is those IEEPA tariffs, and 10% is the result of this reciprocal baseline tariff. And then we have some additional tariffs on top of that. Some are left over from Trump 1.0, where we have Section 301 tariffs, which are those tariffs for IP theft and unfair trade practices. Those are an additional 25%. We also have some tariffs for AD/CVD duties, and then some additional tariffs for different products. And then on top of all of this around the globe, we've got sectoral tariffs. So 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, and then 25% tariffs on autos. And so if you're confused, you're not alone. There are a lot of companies who are trying to figure out exactly what this tariff landscape looks like. But the other thing I'd say about it is that it's very dynamic. This is a moving chessboard. And as the administration is negotiating with different governments on earth, we would expect to see some of these tariff rates come down. And so that leads to the second part of your question, which is on U.S.-China relations and what this London agreement that was negotiated last week means. And effectively, what it does is it is a framework to implement what the United States and China agreed to last month in Geneva, which was effectively a détente from the previous trade embargo. And if you think back just a few weeks ago, we had almost 150% tariffs on each other's imports, which effectively had halted all trade. And so the United States and China got together in Geneva and agreed to, on a reciprocal basis, lower our tariffs down. So China now has a 10% tariff on U.S. imports. The U.S. has that 30% tariff that I talked about, plus some other tariffs on Chinese imports, in exchange for China removing its countermeasures, which were some of these export controls on critical minerals and rare earths, as well as adding a number of companies to their unreliable entity list. And so last week, what we saw the negotiators agree to was a framework to implement that, this definition of what those countermeasures meant. And that's why you saw the issue of Chinese export controls on rare earths and rare earth magnets in particular really hit the headlines as the two sides negotiated a real clear path for China to begin granting licenses for rare earth magnet exports to the United States, and then the United States making some concessions on its own export control measures.
Gotcha. So before we go a little bit deeper on China, can I just ask you, we of course had Liberation Day, and then 6-7 days later, it's all taken down, and the administration vowed to be rolling out frequently bilateral, let's call them term sheets. Sometimes they're called a statement of principles, more paper to follow. Why have we seen only so few of these, like one with the United Kingdom and this sort of detente with China? What's the holdup?
Right. Well, that's one way to look at it, that we're waiting with bated breath to see when these additional agreements will get negotiated. But having spent 10 years as a U.S. trade negotiator, I can tell you that we're moving really at warp speed here. So we do have one deal with the United Kingdom that was announced a few weeks ago. We are waiting to see other deals. We're expecting one potentially with Canada, Mexico, Japan, Vietnam, Israel, and other countries who are actively negotiating. But it's only been a few weeks since the president originally imposed his Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs. And so to get the United States to negotiate simultaneously with every single government on earth to try to get some of these deals, to get concessions on tariff and non-tariff barriers, this is a significant feat. And so while it feels a bit slow, just given the fact that we've already seen one deal and we're waiting for the announcement of any others, from a negotiator's perspective, this is incredibly fast. Now, we do have this July 9th deadline for the president to up those tariffs that are currently at 10%. My expectation is that we'll see quite a few more deals inked just before that deadline.
Gotcha. Okay, so back to the detente with the Chinese. Isn't it true that they had critical minerals export controls on us long before this sort of set of tariff exchanges with them? Weren't they doing this even within the Biden administration?
Yeah, and critical mineral policy and rare earths is something that multiple U.S. administrations have cared a lot about. I remember back in 2011, 2012, when the United States was suing China at the World Trade Organization for some of its market manipulation policies, both for critical minerals and rare earths. The Obama administration looked at this, the Trump administration looked at this, and Trump 1.0, the Biden administration looked at this. So these are long-standing policies by China. But again, this came to a head because China tried to cut off, or at least slow roll, the export of these rare earth magnets that are really important for a number of U.S. commercial sectors, in addition to defense needs. And you began to see the automotive industry in particular really suffering from lack of supply. So that's why this came to a head in the way that it did over the last couple of weeks.
And do you think we should have foreseen this vulnerability or this extra vulnerability from the Chinese before we set out and did so many tariffs? Or was it sort of unexpected that they would go in this direction again?
I don't think it was unexpected. I do think that China has a number of levers that it can pull to put pressure on the United States, where it really does have this chokehold on certain critical supply chains. But that's the problem. And that's part of the problem that the administration is trying to fix, not only with these aggressive tariff rates, but also with some of these sectoral tariffs and export controls and investment restrictions, really using the whole toolkit to figure out ways that the United States can diversify away from China. But part of the problem is this has been growing for not just the last year or two, but for decades. And China had a lot of foresight in terms of trying to build out, again, monopolies and choke points in some of these really important supply chains. And it's not just the United States they're using it on. It's also Europe, Japan, and a number of our allies that have these vulnerabilities. So it really is a broader effort. And I think the Trump administration again, using tariffs for a variety of purposes, but part of it is to try to diversify away from China in some of these more strategic sectors.
And not to get hung up on terminology, but I think it's sort of helpful to understand if we're in decoupling, strategic decoupling, or de-risking more like the Europeans. Is there any usefulness in those terms? What do they say to you, and where would you say we might be?
Yeah, well, if you ask 10 people what they mean by decoupling or strategic decoupling, you may get 10 different answers. So I'm not sure I find those terms particularly helpful. But what I would say, and I think you've heard this both from the Trump administration as well as from the Chinese side, is that nobody is looking to fully decouple at this point, meaning to stop all trade. That is why the United States and China met in Geneva last month to bring some of those tariff rates down, because we had found ourselves backed into a trade embargo that nobody wanted to be in. But that said, for some of these critical sectors like semiconductors, rare earths, potentially pharmaceutical products, things like batteries, there is a real effort to look and see, like, how can we diversify away from an overdependence on China or any other adversary or potential adversary, where in the time of conflict, they have the ability to hit the off button and to really cause some pain. And so that's the conversation that you're seeing play out in Washington right now. It's, what do these sectors look like? Where are our supply chain vulnerabilities? And what measures, in addition to tariffs, should we be using to try to diversify away? But I don't think this is a full decoupling here.
Gotcha. All right. So we started the trade war, and then we went to Geneva and declared a détente, and then figured out a way to begin to implement it from the London Agreement. Where do things stand now? Are the Chinese re-exporting to us critical minerals again? Is this working, or what steps do you anticipate unfolding next?
Right. I think it's a good question. And what I would say is time will tell, because these license applications are on a rolling basis. So what China has said is that they had agreed to issue these licenses for commercial purposes for a period of 6 months. And so the administration is no doubt clearly monitoring this and watching to see whether or not the Chinese follow through quickly with issuing some of those licenses. But on the other hand, we have these broader trade talks that are still happening. And so London was just about this critical issue with rare earth magnets, and then the U.S. countermeasures for Chinese noncompliance, which were U.S.'s own export control measures over the last few weeks. But if you remember, Trump and Xi have said that they're negotiating a broader agreement. And the next deadline that we have is August 9th. And that's when the president has said that he will increase tariff rates on China if the two sides haven't made progress or haven't gotten to some sort of economic deal. So that's the new mile marker that I'm watching for, to see, are there new meetings, what progress has been made? Because clearly I think that the U.S. and China have to show some progress before August 9th. Otherwise, I do think we're going to see another escalation here.
And so what's on that agenda? Is it the stuff from Trump's first term that you had a lot to do with in terms of structural issues with the Chinese economies and intellectual property protection and the subsidies? Or how would you describe the agenda there?
In terms of what the United States and China are going to be looking to make progress on between now and August, I think there are different issues on either side. So from the U.S. perspective, first and foremost, it's going to be that phase one deal that the Trump administration negotiated during Trump's first term. And I think it is very clear that China did not comply with a number of the provisions in that deal. So first, the purchasing agreements on energy and ag products. Chinese purchases fell short. I think the administration will be looking to China to pick up the slack and to follow through with what it committed, but also a number of the substantive provisions. And so that agreement dealt with things related to due process, transparency, as well as forced technology transfer, for IP theft, investment provisions and commitments, and a whole host of other issues. And there will be a serious conversation about seeing if China can at the very least, follow through with the things that it committed to do back in 2019, 2020.
Can I ask you about that before you, just sorry to interrupt. I've heard people say, you know what, China was never going to live up to its obligations under the Phase 1 trade agreement in purchases or in structural changes or transparency and the rest. Is that fair, or was it that COVID interrupted and really gummed up the works?
So I don't think that's necessarily a fair characterization, although I'm certainly not inside the mind of the Chinese government. But the Phase 1 deal, like putting into context, the United States and China had negotiated a much broader set of commitments by China just a few months before, so in the spring of 2019. But that agreement fell apart when the Chinese negotiators brought it back to China for Xi's final sign-off. And then we were back in this tit-for-tat tariff escalation. And so what Phase 1 really was a subset of those broader issues. They were, in fact, the easier issues for China to comply with.
I see. Yeah.
So from my perspective, I think there was an assumption that China was going to follow through with these commitments. And there was also the possibility of a potential Phase 2 at that point, which would have gone back to that broader set of issues that the two sides had nearly agreed to. But I do believe that COVID interfered with a lot of it. Economies around the world shut down. We just weren't buying things from one another. And then, of course, the politics and geopolitics of COVID, I think really spoiled the relationship in a pretty fundamental way. And then it was the Biden administration who didn't hold China accountable for Phase 1. And so that's really how that deal unraveled. But if you're Trump too and you're coming back, I think as an initial confidence building step that you can take China at its word, that if it says it's going to do something, it follows through. You're going to ask for China to abide by the commitments it already made in Phase 1. And I think that's really why the administration was pushing so hard to get China to comply with its Geneva commitments on rare earth magnets, because it was really about this confidence building. Like, you can't negotiate more challenging provisions if you don't have faith that the party across the table is going to follow through with even the most basic of commitments.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. All right, so the agenda going forward is definitely make sure the critical minerals part of this is implemented, but also to get back to the main aspects of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 trade agreements from the first term. And is there anything else?
Well, I also think that a lot has changed in the intervening years. The world looks very different than it did previously. And part of that is just the domestic politics in the United States as well. But I do think that fundamentally what the U.S. is looking for is for China to stop stealing U.S. technology, to stop subsidizing industries to the detriment of the U.S. domestic industry, to stop engaging in excess capacity and overcapacity. And a number of these issues are really fundamentally structural. And they go to the heart of China's economic model, which is really at odds with capitalist systems like the United States and other major economies around the world. So I think this is going to be a very, very difficult negotiation. And then for China's part, right, they're the other side and the other party to this negotiation. They have their own list of asks. And a lot of those have to do with what the U.S. would consider to be pure national security measures. And so this is U.S. export controls on advanced semiconductors. These are investment restrictions. These are forced labor laws and some of these other measures that the U.S. has taken, which traditionally have been very separate from the trade talks. And so for that reason, I think that the U.S. is going to have a number of hard asks. I think China's going to have a number of hard asks. I think this is a really challenging dynamic. But that said, if the alternative is a trade embargo, they're going to have to find their footing somewhere in the middle here. But I do expect Phase 1 at the very least to be on the table between now and August.
Gotcha. So it'll be a tough negotiations going forward. And I guess if past is prologue, if the president feels like he's not making a lot of progress with the Chinese, he may just pull up and start issuing more tariffs on the Chinese to try and condition them to make concessions. Does that sound right? Or do you think once we're in this framework of working together, there won't be any pull-ups to levy more tariffs?
Well, I think there are a lot of dynamics at play. And what was really interesting for me to watch over the past couple of weeks leading up to the London meeting is that the United States wasn't just limiting its retaliation and enforcement to tariffs. The U.S. took a number of steps to use things like U.S. export controls and student visas to really tighten the pressure on China. And I think what that shows is that in Trump 2.0, the president is willing to pull a lot more levers than just tariffs to push China into negotiating. And so we could see an uptick in tariffs. We certainly could see the president raise tariff rates from 30% up to 100% or some other level again. But I also think that we've got a much broader toolkit that the administration is willing to play.
Right.
And that opens up a new front in this potential trade war.
Gotcha. How do you think the administration is seeing tariffs now? Because when we go back to the campaign, we heard national security as a rationale. We heard trying to reshore manufacturing and recreate American manufacturing. We always hear about trade deficits and flat-out reciprocity. Is it all of the above, or are some of these issues necessarily linked to tariffs in perpetuity? For example, if we were really wanted to recreate U.S. manufacturing, would we have to have tariffs for a long period of time? Or since we seem willing to pull some down as a result of negotiations, does that mean we're just working for example, trade deficits or reciprocity as the guiding light?
Yeah, I think that all of these are the basis for these tariff measures. But the distinction I would draw is that every tariff measure has a different legal rationale. And so, the administration talks about national security, they talk about onshoring, they talk about trade deficits, they talk about revenue, to your point. But if you look at things like that 10% across the board tariff that we currently have on every country, nearly every country on earth, this baseline tariff, that to me is about that trade deficit. And it's about trying to rebalance the terms of trade such that you're incentivizing more domestic manufacturing. And it has to do with the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency, so that our currency doesn't adjust in the same way that other currencies might in other types of economies where they're facing this large and sustained trade deficit. And so trying to create this artificial measure to incentivize production is part of that baseline tariff. But if you look at some of these additional tariffs, like that 46% tariff on Vietnam or the 20% tariff on the EU, that's what's being used as leverage to get other countries to come to the table to lower some of their tariff and non-tariff barriers. So that to me is more about negotiations. And then you have these sectoral tariffs like steel and aluminum and autos. And we assume there will be tariffs for pharma and semiconductors and some of these other sectors where there are those 232 investigations. That is about supply chain security. It is about diversifying the U.S. supply chains away from China, away from over-reliance on other countries, and making sure that at a time of conflict, pandemic, war, the United States can produce what it needs to here at home. And so looking at the legal rationale and even the written documents that lawyers write up to justify these measures, you can actually see a very different legal basis for each one of these tools. And so that's why I say the answer is all of the above. I think all of these are reasons for tariffs, but it depends on which tariff.
And it depends on which country, I guess, as well.
Exactly.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Kellyanne Shaw.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Now, this is harder to answer, and it's still early, but when we zoom out a little bit and think about the geopolitical implications, first with China, and then we could talk about other nations, at least the bilateral relationship. How does this U.S.-China framework fit just sort of within our broader strategy in Asia or with China generally? How do you see this as a centerpiece for what President Trump is trying to do?
Yeah, I do agree that it's early because we don't know how this is necessarily going to play out and what some of the final tariff rates will be with a number of Asian countries that we're negotiating with. But I think there are a lot of interesting dynamics here. Now, what's interesting about the Trump administration's economic policies is that they are on par with the national security and foreign policies. And what I mean by that is there was a tremendous amount of frustration from some of the economic advisors in Trump 1.0, and I think the same philosophy holds in Trump 2.0, that for years we weren't going after countries who were discriminating against our companies, who were adopting overly burdensome regulations that weren't tied to science, that had high tariffs compared to the U.S. tariff rates on products, and that were being unreasonable in the trade space because they were our ally or because they were our friend. And so if we needed a country for national security reasons or for foreign policy reasons, we kind of let it go that they were discriminating against us or not giving us equal market access. And so the new element that the Trump administration introduced was this idea of moving some of these economic issues and economic security up to the same level as our national security concerns. And so from the administration's perspective, just because you're our ally or our friend doesn't mean we're not also going to go after you if you're mistreating our companies or our workers. And so both of those things are true at the same time. Now, from the perspective of many of our allies, and particularly those in the Asia-Pacific region, who may not be accustomed to this approach, it feels a bit like they're being attacked in a way that they're not quite used to. And so in some respects, we heard this in Trump 1.0 that, if you tariff us, if you do these things, that's just going to drive us closer to China. You're breaking up this alliance. That didn't prove to be the case in Trump 1.0. And so when we hear some of these same arguments again in Trump 2.0, my guess is the administration looks at it the same way and is like, well, you said that in Trump 1.0. That's not how it played out. We continue to build and grow the alliance and these strong relationships with our allies. But this is really about leveling the playing field. It's really about economic security. That doesn't mean or foreclose that we also want to be national security partners. And so my guess is that's how they're looking at it too. But we'll see how these dynamics play out.
Well, that's fascinating. We're seemingly always trying to recruit people over to our side in this geopolitical contest with the Chinese. And so you think we can, as people say, walk and chew gum at the same time. We can recruit people over while at the same time we're having trade disputes with them.
Well, I think we're going to have to try.
Yeah.
I mean, in the United States, the idea of leaving these economic and trading relationships in such an unbalanced way is just not sustainable from a democratic perspective. You have a large portion of the U.S. population that feels abandoned by the trade policies of the political elite on both sides. And that's why some of these tariff policies are so popular with most of American voters. Now, at the same time, I don't think anyone wants to walk away from our allies or to cede the ground to China when it comes to some of these national security partnerships or regional relationships in the world. So we are going to have to figure out a way to, as you said, walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah. Well, we have a whole basket full of issues here that we need to be able to confront. Maybe we can talk through some of the top bilateral trade agreements that we're seeking. You mentioned Vietnam early on. I usually hear Vietnam in the context of this is a place that many nations have gone to as an alternative to China, maybe because they have cheap labor. But then I hear the administration say we're really worried about Vietnam as a transshipment type of country, and we're going to be really tough on them. What do you think about that? And would you put it up at the top of the list among the Trump administration's priorities?
I think there are a handful of countries that are at the top of that list. And the administration has talked about countries with whom we have large trade deficits and large trading relationships. And I also think there's sort of a third leg to that equation, which is those who are important for geopolitical or national security reasons as well. And I think Vietnam fits a number of those buckets. And you've heard just even in recent days, administration officials talking about progress being made with Vietnam on the negotiation front. But you're right, there are a number of concerns with Vietnam. You know, back during the Obama administration, we had negotiated this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is now the CPTPP. It never entered into force in terms of the U.S. being a member. But one of the major concerns that we heard from folks on the Hill about it in particular was that they were worried about the loss of U.S. manufacturing and manufacturing jobs going to Vietnam. So that was one concern with the agreement. But, you know, fast forward a number of years and where we are with Vietnam now, we have seen a dramatic increase in manufacturing going to Vietnam, but a lot of that was manufacturing that was previously in China. And so after the Trump administration put up those Section 301 tariffs, those 25% tariffs on a number of sectors, a lot of companies moved to Vietnam to try to avoid those tariffs and began exporting to the U.S. in significant number. And so the Trump administration's concern the second time around is that, okay, if you were just a Chinese company who picked up shop and continued to do everything in China except that last stage of production, you moved it to Vietnam so that that good could be a product of Vietnam for purposes of avoiding tariffs, that's really not fair either. And that's what we're trying to put a stop to. And so part of what I expect the administration to be asking from Vietnam is potentially things like changes to rules of origin, which is like a very custom speak way of saying like whether that good is a product of Vietnam for tariff purposes or a product of China, if it still has either Chinese ownership or Chinese content. So I think that's one way we're going to see the administration trying to get at this issue. And another way is really just getting at transshipment and things like customs fraud. Like maybe you've got Chinese goods that are being shipped through Vietnam or a new label gets slapped on. And that's really about just enforcement and making sure that people aren't breaking the law. And so certainly to get a deal with Vietnam, I think we're going to have to see some commitments by Vietnam on those issues. And then also potentially things like labor standards and some of the reasons why manufacturing is so much cheaper in Vietnam to try to level some of the playing field there.
Gotcha. Are there any other bilateral negotiations that we should be sort of pointing to? I know we've got many, but are there any that rise to the top?
Yeah, I think just looking at the list, and if you pull up the list of the countries with whom the U.S. has the largest trade deficit with, Mexico and Canada, China, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, and then Germany and Ireland. So the EU is a trading bloc. Like those are some of the countries that are going to be the most significant in terms of getting some of these deals. And that's why the administration has been talking about this like 18 or so, dozen or so countries that they're so focused on. And together, that will account for the overwhelming majority of the trade deficit and the trading relationship. So if the administration can get those right, or at least fix some of the asymmetries in those relationships, it'll actually go a long way in terms of resolving some of these trade issues.
And talk a little bit about how President Trump has broadened the argument, if you will, with some of these nations in the bilateral context. For example, he's talked about the European Union's, these are some of his staff anyway, who have said it's just sort of a naked power grab and that they are trying to overregulate our social media and tech companies. They're trying to tax them. And I've heard the president say that he's going to stand up for American business and even big tech in the European Union. Does that sound right? Do I have that right? Is that going to be a big thing in addition to everyday tariffs?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And in addition to these tariff asymmetries, the fact that on average, the U.S. tariff rates are significantly lower than those of many of our trading partners, most of the focus is on these non-tariff barriers, these over-regulations, these attacks on the U.S. technology sector. And we're not just seeing that from the EU, but we're also seeing some of these policies come out from countries like Korea. That is going to be a huge focus for the administration. And I have said many times that as tough as I think the deal will be with China, to the extent the U.S. and China are able to reach a deal, I think the deal with the EU is going to be almost even harder. And part of that is because the European Union is such an advanced regulatory state and a regulatory economy, and it's sort of a government on top of a government, just given the structure of the EU, makes it much harder for them to adapt. And to pivot on some of these policies that are so discriminatory towards the U.S. And then on the U.S. side, you have some very deep-seated views that their digital services taxes, digital single market, some of these digital policies that they have, as well as the common agricultural policy and regulations related to agriculture are just so difficult for U.S. exporters that the EU is going to have to address them. So you definitely have a stalemate that is teeing up to be a very, very difficult conversation.
So here's the way I'm sort of seeing this. While it's been disruptive and maybe it was just sort of shock and awe the first day that we called Liberation Day, what the president has created is an opportunity to renegotiate our trading relationships with some of the biggest economies in the world. And there's really no way this could have been done multilaterally for those who still wish for the days of the Doha round and the rest. And so this is an opening of a new economic front that has real promise for U.S. economic growth. Is that a fair way to look at it? It might be tough getting there, and there's going to be a lot of turbulence, but fundamentally, isn't that something that the president's created?
That's exactly right. And in a perfect world, if you have tariff rates that have been locked in time for the past 30 years, where the U.S. agreed to an average tariff rate of around 3%, you have other major trading partners who have average tariff rates in the teens and 20s, you would go back to the World Trade Organization and try to renegotiate what's called those bound rates, those tariff rates, and some of the non-tariff barriers. But the problem with the World Trade Organization is there are 166 countries, all of which have to agree by consensus. And that is an impossible task right now. And I don't think there's any serious trading partner on earth who thinks that that's a viable path forward. So what you have is the president who's effectively taken a sledgehammer to the global trading system, and they're certainly not shy about saying so, in the hopes of breaking it to fix it in a way that is much more balanced and even. And so if this strategy works, and it's unprecedented, it's never been tried before, so nobody's quite sure where this is going, but if it works, the hope is that the United States will be in a place where its trading relationships are much more equitable and we're doing more trade with other governments and other countries, not less.
But for people, just for historical purposes, if you will, if they wonder why we had lower tariffs here to import goods into the United States, that was because within the context of an enormous 166 country multilateral trade agreement, we had some wins and we had some losses, and they all got baked in together, right? I mean, they weren't selling out the country per se, like some say. It was, we're going to get enhancements in some areas and we're going to lose in others. Is that pretty much right?
It is, with a caveat. The whole concept of the World Trade Organization, which was officially formed in 1995, the predecessor project was the GATT, which was one of these Bretton Woods post-World War II institutions. is that it was built on the national security theory that countries that trade together are less likely to go to war against each other. And that is the underlying rationale for a number of these international organizations and projects that were built during that time. And so the U.S. took the view that it needed to cut its own tariffs first to give war-torn Europe and other governments access to its market to help rebuild their economies as well, in that the more we're trading, the less likely we are to repeat and have a World War III. And so the U.S. so believed in this project that we were the first mover. We were continuing to cut our tariffs and non-tariff barriers in the hopes that other countries would follow. And they did to some extent, but then they stopped. And then we got to 1995 and locked ourselves into these tariff rates with no real ability to further evolve the system. It just kind of locked up with gridlock and indecision. And so I don't think it was any one decision to say we're just going to sell our country out. I think it was built on this premise that everyone else would see the light and follow. But that's just not how history played out. And so we're kind of stuck, and we've been stuck for the last few decades. And so this is a different approach. It's saying, okay, let's just effectively break it and start over to a large extent and see where we go. But it's also built on the belief that the status quo is unsustainable, and the status quo is a national security threat, and the status quo is a threat, in fact, to U.S. democracy, because it is just not sustainable from a democratic perspective.
Yeah, so was it then the Doha round that would have begun to unlock these unfair tariff rates from the past, and when that died, but people began to step up ideologically and say this is unfair to the United States now? Is that kind of how it went?
I think that is in large part how it went.
All right. Well, as I walk you through just sort of the trade graveyard, which I'm doing just because it's sort of interesting and brings us to where we are today, there were a lot of people that were trying to pivot to Asia and trying to talk about building an economic alliance against the Chinese that came up with TPP. And of course, that's gone nowhere. And President Trump and even Clinton, I think, were not excited about it. And the Japanese came up with an alternative. And no one thinks that the TPP will ever be resurrected, as I understand it. But is there any chance, or is there any geopolitical promise in trying to bind with non-Chinese Asian countries to sort of box out the Chinese in a trading system? Or is that like, maybe it's around digital trade, I've heard people say. Is that idea even viable anymore, or is that just gone with the wind?
I think it's not just a U.S. problem anymore. I think that the idea of these large, comprehensive free trade agreements is now part of the bygone era. What I think instead is that we are likely to see some of these supply chain style agreements. Like we're beginning to see with steel. The U.S. and the U.K. have agreed to certain provisions on steel, and the U.K. will potentially adopt some of the same U.S. tariff rates, and also trying to keep Chinese content out of that supply chain. I expect Canada and Mexico will likely agree to something similar. So things like steel or semiconductors, potentially even pharmaceutical products, we might see groupings of allied countries taking on certain commitments to basically create these clubs where if you're in the club, you have preferential access to one another's markets for those products. You'll use each other's suppliers in terms of inputs throughout the supply chain. But if you're out of the club, you'll face very high tariffs or barriers to that market. And so I can certainly see something like that with a grouping of Asian countries in the U.S. But I think in terms of these broad-based, comprehensive free trade agreements, I don't see a future for that anytime soon.
Gotcha. And so if you had to just sort of look through your crystal ball, we've got a lot of bilateral trade agreements and things that we want to renegotiate. This is pretty much going to be going on throughout Trump 2.0, right? I mean, it's going to take a year, I would think, to even get term sheets together or statements of principles or whatever we're calling. And then it's got to be, well, tell me, what happens then? Do we have to pass a law, or how does it affect the actual rates, or are those revised within the executive branch?
Yeah, I think your view on that may depend whether you work for the administration or for Congress in terms of who has authority. But what I would say is if the U.S. is not cutting its own tariff rates, there is less need for that type of agreement to go to Congress. So if all the concessions are on the part of the other trading partner and the U.S. is not making many, if any, changes, there's less of a need for legislation in that case. But that said, if you want to make policy durable, baking it in through legislation makes it administration-proof, meaning the next administration can't just undo everything that the previous administration did by executive order. And so there is a bit of an argument to get Congress involved in some of this. But right now, everything is very executive-heavy, and Congress is giving the president a relatively long leash to go forth and negotiate and try to see what he can do in terms of resolving some of these trade imbalances. But it is a very interesting question. I do think that trade lawyers like myself and others are going to be very busy for the foreseeable future. None of these issues are going to get fixed overnight. We didn't get here overnight. It's going to take years and years and years to fix some of these relationships. And some of that will move well beyond this administration and into the next one as well. So I do think we're looking at a protracted period of negotiation, a protracted period of trying to fix these trading issues. But I'm not surprised to see quite a bit of flurry of activity right out the gate because this president only has 4 years to get all that he can done. And so he's going to hit the gas and go as hard and as fast as he can to try to change some things before those 4 years are over.
All right, well, that makes perfect sense. But there's just one last issue. That's interesting. We never really hear of what the other side wants. I haven't heard so much about what Japan and India and other countries might be asking of us. I guess we know a little bit about what the Chinese would want from us. We don't necessarily have to get into it here, but I'm sure they're not just going to give us concessions for free, are they? They have their own wish lists.
I can assure you every country has its own wish list from the United States. But here's what I'll say. From the administration's perspective, these trading relationships have been imbalanced for decades. And so what the United States is looking for is for parity. Like you treat us the way we treat you and vice versa. But of course, as a negotiator, the best deals are those where both parties feel like they got something out of it. So different countries have different requests. What I'm hearing a lot of in speaking to different governments who are at the table is that they're very concerned about these sectoral tariffs in particular. So these 232 steel, aluminum, autos, pharma tariffs, for example. So a lot of the play is in those conversations and whether or not the administration will give them some tariff relief on those sectoral tariffs. But, certainly there are asks by other governments. It just depends which one.
Kellyanne Shaw, you were the perfect person to talk to about not just trade policy, but trade law and the geopolitics thereof. Thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoyed it.
That was Kellyanne Shaw. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.